1324 BC. The Valley of the Kings lies silent beneath the Egyptian sun, and in the royal palace at Thebes, a young pharaoh burns with fever. His name is Tutankhamun, the boy king who ascended to the throne at 9 years old, and now at 19. His body trembles with infection from a broken leg that has festered, turned poisonous, spreading through his weakened frame. The physicians gather with their herbs and incantations. The priests prepare the rituals for his journey to the afterlife. But as the sun sets over the Nile, something unexpected occurs. The fever does not climb higher. The infection does not spread. Instead, slowly, impossibly, the young king's breathing steadies. His eyes open. He looks upon his advisors, upon A who had expected to claim the throne, upon Horem who had prepared for transition, and he speaks, his voice weak but clear, demanding water, demanding to know how many days he has lost. The palace falls into confused silence. This was not the ending they had anticipated. The priests consult their scrolls, searching for meaning in this deviation from fate, and outside, the Nile continues its eternal flow, indifferent to the fact that the boy king who should have died has not. The golden death mask that would have made him immortal in memory will never be crafted. The tomb that would have preserved his name for millennia will remain empty. Instead, Tutankhamun rises from his sickbed, his legs still damaged but healing, and begins a reign that will stretch beyond all mortal comprehension, into centuries that cannot yet imagine him, into a world that will forget and remember and forget again the sound of his true name. The courtiers whisper among themselves, "Is this the work of Amun, the god he restored after his father's heresy? Is this divine intervention, a sign that the young pharaoh is favored beyond all previous rulers? Or is it something else, something that cannot be named, something that exists outside the boundaries of their understanding of life and death and the eternal cycle that governs all things?" The first century of his impossible life moves slowly, like water seeping through limestone, like sand accumulating grain by grain in the desert wind. Tutankhamun, who should have been buried at 19, reaches his 30th year, then his 40th, and the whispers begin. The priests speak in hushed tones about the Ka, the life force that should have departed to the field of reeds. The common people begin to notice that their pharaoh does not age as other men age. His face, still young, still unmarked by the deep lines that come with time, becomes a source of both reverence and quiet fear. He buries A, the advisor who had guided his youth, watching as the old man's body is mummified and placed in a tomb that was originally prepared for the pharaoh himself. He watches Horem, the general who had waited for power, grow old and brittle before finally ascending to co-rule and then passing into dust. Tutankhamun remains. He marries again, after Ankhesenamun, his half-sister and first wife, dies in her 43rd year, and he feels, perhaps for the first time, the terrible weight of continuance. The Egypt of his youth, still recovering from his father Akhenaten's religious upheaval, stabilizes under his extended reign. The temples to Amun grow grander, more elaborate, their walls covered in inscriptions that praise the eternal pharaoh, the one who does not fade. The priesthood, which had been shattered by the Aten heresy, consolidates power once more, and Tutankhamun, who had restored the old gods as a boy, now watches those same gods fail to explain his own existence. By his 100th year, he has stopped counting. The palace keeps records, meticulous accounts of regnal years that stretch beyond all precedent, but he no longer asks to see them. He rules with the accumulated wisdom of decades, settling disputes with a patience that seems almost inhuman, because in a sense, it is. The Egypt of 1200 BC knows him not as the boy king who died young, but as the eternal pharaoh, the one who persists while dynasties should have changed around him. The farmers who work the fields along the Nile speak his name with a mixture of awe and unease. He has been pharaoh since their great-grandparents were children, and the continuity is both reassuring and deeply strange, a violation of the natural order that even the most devout cannot fully reconcile with their understanding of how the world works. 300 years pass, and the world begins its slow transformation. Tutankhamun, now impossibly ancient yet appearing no older than 40, has witnessed the rise and fall of pharaohs in other kingdoms, the shifting of power in Mesopotamia, the growth of civilizations in distant lands he knows only through traders' tales. Egypt itself has changed around him. The new kingdom reaches its height under the Ramessids, and Tutankhamun, who rules from a palace rebuilt 7 times over, maintains his position through a combination of divine authority and the simple fact that no one can remember a time before him. The priests have woven his immortality into religious doctrine. He is no longer merely pharaoh, but the living embodiment of Horus, the bridge between mortal and divine. Children are born, grow old, and die having never known an Egypt without Tutankhamun. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, already ancient when he was born, have become even more remote monuments to a past that seems mythological even to him. He sometimes rides out to Giza, standing in the shadow of Khufu's Great Pyramid, wondering if those early pharaohs, too, had harbored secrets about death and time. He places his hand against the limestone blocks, feeling the heat absorbed from the sun, and he calculates. These pyramids are already 1500 years old when he touches them, built by men whose names are legend even in his youth, and now he has lived through a fifth of the time that separates him from their construction. The thought makes him dizzy with temporal vertigo. The Sea Peoples invade in the 13th century BC, and Tutankhamun, drawing on 3 centuries of tactical knowledge, coordinates defenses that preserve Egypt when other Bronze Age civilizations collapse into chaos. The Hittite Empire crumbles. Mycenaean Greece falls into its dark age. The great cities of the Levant burn, but Egypt, with its immortal pharaoh, endures. He has learned, by now, not to grow too attached to advisors, to generals, to the women he takes as wives. They all fade. He remains, a constant in the changing current of the Nile, watching generations bloom and wither like lotus flowers in the palace pools. He develops strategies for emotional distance. He loves, yes, but with a part of himself held in reserve, knowing that attachment leads to grief, and he has accumulated more grief than any human should be capable of bearing. Yet he bears it, because what choice does he have? By the 1st millennium BC, Tutankhamun has ruled for over 300 years, and Egypt itself begins to fragment under pressures he cannot fully control despite his accumulated centuries of wisdom. The 3rd intermediate period arrives with its competing dynasties, and for the first time since his impossible survival, Tutankhamun faces a crisis of authority. The kingdom splits. Tanis rises in the north, Thebes asserts independence in the south, and he, the pharaoh who should unite them by divine right, finds his power challenged not by mortality but by simple geography and ambition. He chooses Thebes, the city of his youth, the place where he first defied death. The northern pharaohs claim their own legitimacy, and Egypt, which had remained unified under his watch for centuries, fractures. He feels this as a personal failure, 400 years of rule, and still he could not prevent the inevitable centrifugal forces of empire. The Nubians invade from the south, establishing the 25th dynasty, and Tutankhamun, rather than fight, negotiates. He has learned, over his vast lifespan, when to bend and when to resist. The Nubian pharaohs treat him with cautious respect, this strange eternal figure who predates their own gods' memories. He watches as they adopt Egyptian customs, as they restore temples he himself dedicated centuries before, and he wonders, in the quiet hours before dawn, whether his continued existence has preserved Egypt or trapped it in an endless loop of repetition. The Assyrians come next, sweeping down from Mesopotamia with iron weapons and ruthless efficiency. For the first time in his long life, Tutankhamun knows true military defeat. Thebes falls to Ashurbanipal's armies in 663 BC, and he flees south, into Nubia, watching the city of his resurrection burn against the night sky. He stands on a hillside, surrounded by a small guard of loyal soldiers, and he watches the flames consume the palace where he recovered from his death fever 661 years earlier. And he weeps, not just for the city, but for the realization that even immortality cannot protect what you love, cannot preserve the places and people and moments that matter, cannot stop the relentless forward motion of time and change and destruction. The centuries in exile pass differently. Time feels heavier when one is displaced from the land that gave birth to immortality. Tutankhamun, now over 600 years old, lives in the Nubian court as a curiosity, a relic, a former pharaoh who has outlived his kingdom's supremacy. The Nubians treat him well, with the reverence due to living history, but he is no longer a ruler. He is a symbol, a talisman, a connection to Egypt's glorious past. He studies. He reads. He learns languages he never needed before. Aramaic, early Greek, the trading tongues of Mediterranean merchants who bring news of a world expanding beyond the Nile Valley. The Persians conquer Egypt in 525 BC, and Tutankhamun hears the reports from his southern refuge, learning how Cambyses claims the double crown, how the Egyptian priesthood bends to yet another foreign power. He does not attempt to return. What would be the point? He is one man, however ancient, and empires rise and fall according to forces larger than individual will. He spends decades in contemplation, living simply in a small house near the Third Cataract, watching the Nile flow northward toward the Egypt he can no longer call his own. Alexander the Great conquers Egypt in 332 BC, and Tutankhamun, hearing the news in his Nubian refuge, feels a strange pull to return. He travels north, moving slowly through a landscape that is familiar yet utterly transformed. The Egypt of the Ptolemies is Greek in its upper echelons. Alexandria rises as a cosmopolitan center of learning that eclipses ancient Memphis and Thebes. He enters the city as a wanderer, his true identity hidden beneath simple robes, and he walks the streets of the great library, listening to scholars debate philosophy in languages that would have been foreign to the priests of his youth. No one recognizes him. How could they? The living pharaoh who defied death 1,000 years ago is not part of Ptolemaic history. He is, at best, a fragment of legend, a name mentioned in dusty records that even the Egyptian priests struggle to verify. The library contains some texts from his era, and he reads them in the reading rooms, seeing his own reign described in hieratic script. The events he lived through reduced to brief notations about temple restorations and tribute payments. His near-death and recovery are not mentioned. The scribes of later centuries assumed he died at 19, as planned, as expected, and no one thought to verify whether the pharaoh who continued ruling was the same person or a successor who took the same name. He meets Ptolemy too, claiming to be a distant descendant of the old royal line, and is granted a minor position in the bureaucracy, keeper of records, cataloguer of ancient texts. For 200 years, he lives quietly in Alexandria, watching as the Ptolemaic dynasty gradually Egyptianizes, as Greek rulers adopt pharaonic titles and marry their siblings in the old tradition, and build temples to Egyptian gods they barely understand. He works in the library, preserving documents, translating between ancient Egyptian and Greek, and he sometimes slips corrections into the scholarly works, small adjustments to historical accounts, details that only he would know because he was there, because he remembers. Cleopatra VII rises to power, and Tutankhamun, now using the name Ptolemaios among the Greeks, watches her political maneuvering with the appreciation of someone who has played the same games for over a millennium. She is brilliant, ambitious, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. He recognizes the pattern because he has lived it many times over. When she dies in 30 BC and Egypt becomes a province of Rome, he feels a profound shift. The last pharaoh is gone, the last pretense of Egyptian sovereignty dissolved, and for the first time in his impossibly long life, Egypt is truly no longer his in any meaningful sense. He stays in Alexandria through the Roman period, watching as the city transforms, as Latin mingles with Greek and Egyptian in the streets, as new gods from distant provinces find worshippers in the cosmopolitan port. The library begins to decline, not through a single catastrophic fire, as later legends will claim, but through gradual neglect, budget cuts, the slow erosion of institutional support. He watches scrolls crumble, sees irreplaceable texts lost to moisture and insects and simple lack of care, and he saves what he can, smuggling documents out, hiding them in sealed jars buried in secret locations around the city. He creates his own archive, a shadow library that contains texts the official institution is allowing to decay, works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, philosophy, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world preserved by one impossibly old man who understands, better than anyone, that everything is temporary except his own unwanted persistence. The Roman period stretches before him like an endless corridor, centuries blending into centuries, emperors rising and falling with the predictability of Nile floods. Tutankhamun, now using the name Ptolemaios among the Greeks, Amunseth among the remaining Egyptian communities, moves through the empire like a ghost. He witnesses the birth of Christianity in a small province called Judea. At first, it is merely another mystery cult among many, but he watches, with the patience of millennia, as it spreads through the Roman world like morning light across the desert. He reads the Gospels in Greek when they begin to circulate, recognizing in them themes that echo Egyptian mythology, resurrection, eternal life, the judgment of the dead. By the 4th century AD, when Constantine converts and Christianity becomes the empire's official religion, Tutankhamun has been alive for over 1600 years. The temples of Amun, which he restored in his youth, are abandoned, then destroyed, then forgotten. The priests who once proclaimed his divine nature are gone. The language itself, ancient Egyptian, fades into a script that fewer and fewer can read. He is one of the last who remembers the old tongue fluently, who can look at hieroglyphs and hear the voices of his original advisors, of Horem, of his wife Ankhesenamun, whose face he can still recall with painful clarity though she has been dust for over a millennium. He teaches himself Coptic, the final evolution of the Egyptian language, written in Greek letters with a handful of demotic characters. It is recognizable, barely, like hearing a distant descendant speak and catching echoes of ancestral speech patterns in their modern vocabulary. The last temple to the old gods closes in 537 AD, when Justinian orders the temple of Isis at Philae shut down, and Tutankhamun, who travels there to witness the end, stands in the empty sanctuary and speaks the ancient prayers aloud, his voice the only one remaining who remembers the proper pronunciation, the correct intonation, the original meaning behind words that have been degraded through centuries of misunderstanding and approximation. Islam rises in the 7th century, sweeping through Egypt with a new certainty, a new order. The Arab conquest transforms Cairo into a great medieval city, and Tutankhamun, who has survived every previous transition, adapts once more. He learns Arabic. He studies the Quran. He becomes a merchant, trading in antiquities, ancient scarabs, fragments of pottery, items from an Egypt that no one alive remembers except him. Sometimes, in the Cairo markets, he handles objects from his own reign, relics that he himself commissioned, and he feels a vertigo so profound that he must sit down, breathing slowly, reminding himself that he is real, that this persistence is not a dream. He holds a scarab bearing his cartouche, his name in hieroglyphs, and he remembers the day it was carved, remembers the artisan who made it, a man named Userhat who had 3 children and a talent for capturing detail in miniature. Userhat has been dead for 2,000 years, his children's children's children lost to time. But the scarab remains, and Tutankhamun, impossibly, remains as well. The Fatimid Caliphate establishes Cairo as its capital, and he walks the newly built streets, observing the architecture that blends Islamic design with echoes of older Egyptian sensibilities, the use of columns, the attention to astronomical alignments, the ways that new religions inevitably absorb elements of what came before. He has seen this pattern repeat. Christianity incorporating pagan festivals, Islam building mosques on the sites of ancient temples, each new system claiming total novelty while drawing deeply from the well of accumulated human spiritual practice. The Crusades come and go like violent storms. Tutankhamun watches from the shadows as European knights clash with Saracen warriors over land that has changed hands so many times in his memory that the concept of ownership seems almost absurd. He has been alive for over 2,000 years by the time Saladin recaptures Jerusalem, and he feels a weariness that goes beyond physical exhaustion. It is the fatigue of watching humanity repeat the same conflicts with different names, different gods, different weapons, but always the same fundamental struggles for power and survival. The Mamluk period arrives, bringing with it magnificent architecture, and Tutankhamun, who has developed an appreciation for building styles across his vast lifespan, admires the mosques and madrasas that rise in Cairo, their domes and minarets creating a skyline utterly different from the temple complexes of his youth yet possessing their own austere beauty. He apprentices himself to a master stonemason, learning medieval techniques, comparing them mentally to the methods used in constructing Karnak and Luxor, finding that some principles remain constant: the importance of foundation, the mathematics of weight distribution, the understanding that great buildings require not just vision but patience and precision in execution. The Ottoman conquest arrives in 1517, and Egypt becomes a province of empires that rule from distant capitals. Constantinople, then Istanbul. Tutankhamun, who once commanded the greatest civilization on earth, is now merely one man among millions in a backwater of a vast empire. He travels during these centuries, by ship to Europe during the Renaissance, walking through Florence and Rome, seeing his own Egypt reflected in the classical obsessions of Italian artists who paint and sculpt based on Greek and Roman copies of Egyptian forms that he himself knew in their original context. He stands before a statue in the Vatican, recognizing the face of Ramesses II, a pharaoh who ruled 800 years after his own birth, and he realizes that even to scholars, even to those who dedicate their lives to studying ancient Egypt, he himself is invisible, too old, too early, belonging to a period that has left almost no trace. The 18th dynasty, his dynasty, is known primarily through fragmentary records and a few surviving monuments. The richness of the culture, the complexity of daily life, the personalities of the people he knew, all reduced to academic speculation and educated guesswork. He considers, during his time in Renaissance Italy, revealing himself, showing scholars that he has lived through everything they study. But what proof could he offer? His body appears middle-aged, unremarkable. The Egyptian he speaks is the Middle Kingdom dialect of his youth, which sounds archaic even to the few Arabic-speaking Egyptian scribes who still know any ancient form of the language. He has no documents, no physical evidence that would survive scholarly scrutiny, and more than that, he fears what revelation would bring. Imprisonment, perhaps, by authorities who would see him as either a madman or a dangerous anomaly. Medical examination, dissection even, in the name of understanding this biological impossibility. So he remains silent, walking through the Uffizi Gallery in 1570-something, looking at paintings of Egyptian scenes rendered by artists who have never seen the Nile, who base their work on Roman copies and imaginative speculation, getting almost everything wrong yet capturing something essential about the allure of antiquity, the human fascination with civilizations that rose and fell and left behind monuments that outlast memory. The Enlightenment brings new ways of thinking about time, about history, about the possibility of knowledge, and Tutankhamun, now approaching 3,000 years of life, finds himself in Paris during the French Revolution, watching as the old certainties of monarchy and divine right crumble before secular reason. He had been pharaoh under the principle of divine kingship, the idea that rulers were gods or God-chosen, that their authority descended from heaven rather than rising from earthly consent. And here, now, in 1793, he watches as another king, Louis XVI, is beheaded in the name of popular sovereignty. The execution takes place in what is now called the Place de la Révolution, and Tutankhamun stands in the crowd, watching the blade fall, hearing the roar of approval from thousands of throats, and he thinks about all the forms of government he has witnessed: theocracy, monarchy, oligarchy, empire, caliphate, and now this, democracy born in blood and chaos, proclaiming universal rights while simultaneously unleashing terror against its enemies. He wonders if this new system will prove more durable than those that came before, or if it too will reveal itself as another turn of the wheel, another attempt to organize human society that contains within itself the seeds of its own transformation or destruction. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1798 brings him back to the Nile. He follows the French army south, watching as they catalogue and sketch and measure the monuments of his youth. The soldiers are mostly ignorant of what they are documenting, treating the expedition as adventure and conquest. But the savants, the scholars who accompany the military force, approach the ruins with something approaching reverence. He watches them sketch the temple at Dendera, measuring columns, copying inscriptions, and he is struck by the irony. They are documenting a civilization he knew firsthand, preserving in their drawings and notes details that exist in his memory, but nowhere else, creating a record that will outlast him if he ever does finally die. The Rosetta Stone is discovered, and Tutankhamun, standing among the crowd of curious locals, looks at the trilingual inscription and realizes that this will be the key that unlocks the language he has kept alive only in his own memory. The stone contains text in hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek, the same message in 3 scripts, and he knows, with the certainty of someone who understands how knowledge works, that scholars will use the Greek to crack the code of the ancient Egyptian, that the language of his childhood will speak again to modern ears after centuries of silence. Champollion deciphers hieroglyphs in 1822, and suddenly, after millennia of silence, the ancient texts begin to speak again to modern ears, though what they say is filtered through European understanding, through colonial ambitions, through a lens that cannot grasp the living reality of the civilization they describe. Tutankhamun reads the early Egyptological texts with a mixture of amusement and sorrow. They get so much wrong, these earnest scholars, misunderstanding religious symbolism, imposing their own cultural assumptions onto practices that made perfect sense in context but seem bizarre when viewed from the outside. And yet they are trying, reaching back across impossible distances of time to touch something true. He respects the effort even as he mourns the inevitable distortions. The 19th century unfolds with its obsessions, mummy unwrappings as public entertainment, the looting of tombs, the transport of obelisks to London and Paris and New York. He watches as his civilization is disassembled and distributed across European museums, becoming curiosities, objects of exotic fascination rather than components of a living culture. He attends a mummy unwrapping in London in 1851, standing at the back of the crowded theatre, watching as a physician named Thomas Pettigrew cuts through linen wrappings to reveal the desiccated corpse of someone who might have been a contemporary of his, someone he might have known 3,000 years ago when they were both young and alive. The audience gasps and applauds as if this were entertainment rather than desecration, and Tutankhamun leaves quietly, feeling sick, wondering how his own body would be treated if anyone knew what he was, whether he too would end up on display, an eternal freak show, the immortal pharaoh preserved not by mummification but by impossible biology. He could stop them, perhaps, reveal himself, claim authority, but who would believe him? And what would it change? The world has moved on. The tombs are being emptied regardless of what one peculiar old man might say about respecting the dead. The museums are being filled. The European powers are carving up Africa and the Middle East, and Egypt, his Egypt, has become a piece in their imperial games. The 20th century arrives with machinery and world wars and technologies that would seem like magic to any pharaoh of the new kingdom. But Tutankhamun has had 3,000 years to adjust to change, and he adapts to automobiles and airplanes with the same patient acceptance he brought to Arabic and Christianity and everything else that replaced what came before. He is in Egypt in 1922 when Howard Carter discovers a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb that should have been his own, had he died at 19 as history intended. He travels to Luxor, mingling with the workers and journalists, and he watches as Carter removes the seal from the entrance. The moment is strange beyond description. He is witnessing the discovery of his own supposed burial place, the tomb that was prepared for him but never used because the death that should have claimed him never arrived. The treasures that emerge are meant for someone else, some other Tutankhamun who died young, a golden mask of a boy pharaoh, eternal in death. He looks at that mask, at the idealized features that bear only passing resemblance to his own long-lived face, and he feels a profound disconnection. The mask was made for him, yes, crafted by artisans who worked from life to capture his features at 19, but he is no longer that person, if he ever truly was. 3,000 years have changed him in ways that go beyond physical appearance. The accumulation of memory, experience, grief, wisdom, weariness. He is so far removed from the boy king that the mask might as well represent a stranger. The world becomes obsessed with King Tut, the boy king, the child pharaoh whose tomb was found intact, whose treasures tour the world, whose name becomes synonymous with ancient Egypt. And the real Tutankhamun, standing in a Cairo cafe, reading newspaper accounts of his own supposed death and burial, can only smile sadly at the irony. They have made him famous for dying, when his real achievement, his impossible achievement, was surviving. The discovery creates a renewed fascination with ancient Egypt, and Tutankhamun watches as his civilization becomes popular culture, movies featuring mummies and curses, Art Deco designs incorporating Egyptian motifs, tourists flooding to Luxor to see the monuments he knew when they were new. He finds the commercialization distasteful but understandable. Every culture that captures public imagination eventually becomes commodified, reduced to its most marketable elements, and ancient Egypt, with its visual drama and mysterious exoticism, is perfectly suited to mass consumption. The Second World War rages, and he moves through it like a shadow, having seen too many wars to be shocked by even the most modern horrors. He is in Europe during the Blitz, in North Africa when Rommel and Montgomery clash across deserts he crossed on foot 3,000 years earlier. The scale of destruction is unprecedented, entire cities leveled, millions dead in industrial killing that would have been unimaginable to the warriors of his youth who fought with bronze swords and arrows. And yet the fundamental nature of war remains unchanged. Territory, resources, ideology, the same drivers that motivated the conflicts between Egypt and the Hittites, between the Sea Peoples and the settled civilizations of the Bronze Age. He is in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb falls. No, he leaves Japan months before, something in his bones warning him of catastrophe, the same instinct that has kept him alive through plague and invasion and the collapse of civilizations. When he hears the news, sees the photographs of the mushroom cloud and the devastation below, he understands that humanity has achieved something terrible and new. The capacity for instantaneous mass destruction, the ability to end not just individual lives or cities but potentially all life if the weapons proliferate sufficiently. The post-war world reorganizes itself around new powers, new ideologies, and Egypt achieves independence, then stumbles through decades of political upheaval. NASA nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1956, and Tutankhamun, who remembers when the canal was first proposed by early dreamers who lacked the technology to build it, who remembers when the isthmus was solid land connecting Africa to Asia, watches as modern Egypt asserts itself against the fading empires of Europe, the same Europe that had carved up his homeland like spoils of war. He has no stake in these politics. Not really. He has outlived the passion for governance that once drove him, the young pharaoh who restored temples and negotiated with Hittites and believed that he could control the flow of history. 3,000 years have taught him that history flows according to its own logic, indifferent to individual will, even the will of someone who cannot die. He watches the independence celebrations in Cairo, the crowds cheering in the streets, the removal of British soldiers from bases they had occupied for decades, and he feels a distant satisfaction. Egypt is Egyptian again, at least nominally, governed by Egyptians even if the Egypt they govern bears little resemblance to the civilization he once ruled. The late 20th century accelerates around him: computers, space travel, genetic engineering, the decoding of DNA. Scientists could, theoretically, sample his blood and find something unusual, some genetic anomaly that explains his persistence. But he is careful, always careful, avoiding medical attention, moving between cities and countries often enough that no one notices his failure to age. He watches the King Tut exhibition tour the world again in the 1970s and 90s, sees children wearing t-shirts with the golden mask, hears pop songs reference his supposed name, and he thinks about the strange immortality of fame versus the stranger immortality of actual continued existence. One makes you a legend, the other makes you lonely beyond comprehension. He stands in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1978, watching crowds file past the treasures from his tomb, listening to their awed comments, their speculation about the boy king's life and death, and he is invisible among them, another middle-aged tourist with a catalogue and comfortable shoes. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stands transfixed before the golden mask, and her mother explains that this pharaoh died when he was very young, that his tomb was filled with treasures for the afterlife, that ancient Egyptians believed in eternal life after death. The girl asks if it worked, if he's alive somewhere in the afterlife, and the mother laughs gently and says it's just a story, that the real immortality is in being remembered, in having people still talk about you thousands of years later. Tutankhamun, standing 3 feet away, almost speaks, almost tells them that yes, it worked, that he is alive, that immortality is real but nothing like they imagine. But he stays silent, and the moment passes, and they move on to the next display case. The new millennium arrives with its digital revolutions and its global connectivity, and Tutankhamun, now over 3,300 years old, learns to use the internet, creates false identities with fabricated histories, moves through social networks like a ghost, sometimes engaging in online forums about ancient Egypt, dropping hints and corrections that Egyptologists dismiss as the ravings of an overly confident amateur. He finds a certain amusement in this, being corrected by scholars about events he witnessed firsthand, being told he's wrong about details he knows with absolute certainty because he was there, because these are not academic questions for him but memories, lived experiences that have calcified over millennia into something stranger than history, more personal than scholarship. The 21st century brings him to a question he has avoided for millennia. What is the purpose of this continuation? He has contributed nothing unique to human civilization in the last 2,000 years. His immortality, which seemed like a gift or a curse in those early centuries, has resolved into neither. It is simply a condition, a state of being that persists without meaning or end. He walks through the Cairo Museum, looking at artifacts from the 18th dynasty, objects he remembers being made, seeing the wear and damage of time on everything except himself. The museum guards eye him suspiciously. He has been visiting too regularly, staring too long at particular pieces, and they wonder if he is planning a theft. How could he explain that he is simply looking at objects from his youth, the way an old man might look at photographs from childhood? Except that his childhood was 3 millennia ago, and these are not photographs but the actual physical things themselves, surviving when everyone and everything else has long since crumbled into dust. A Ushapti figure catches his eye, a small funerary statue meant to serve the dead in the afterlife, and he remembers watching these being carved, remembers the workshop where they were made, the smell of acacia wood and the sound of chisels against stone. He had ordered hundreds of them made, preparing for a death that never came, and now they sit behind glass, labeled with his name, catalogued as artifacts from a tomb that remained empty while he continued living, year after year, century after century, until the boy king who commissioned these figures became a memory even to himself. The Arab Spring erupts in 2011, and Tutankhamun, who has witnessed more political upheavals than he can count, watches the protests in Tahrir Square with a detached sympathy. He understands the desire for change, for renewal, for breaking free from the weight of the past. But he also knows, with the accumulated certainty of his impossible lifespan, that revolutions rarely deliver what they promise, that the patterns repeat endlessly, power and resistance, structure and chaos, hope and disillusionment cycling through generations like the seasons. He walks through the crowds in Tahrir Square on a February evening in 2011, surrounded by young Egyptians demanding democracy and dignity and an end to corruption, and he feels both connection and alienation. These are his people, Egyptians, descendants of the civilization he helped guide through its golden age. And yet they are so far removed from anything he knew that he might as well be an alien observing human behavior from a distance. Climate change begins to alter even the Nile, that eternal river that has been the one constant in his entire existence. And for the first time in 3,000 years, Tutankhamun feels genuine fear. If the Nile fails, if Egypt itself becomes uninhabitable through heat and drought and the rising seas, where does he go? What is he without Egypt? His immortality is bound to this place in ways he cannot fully articulate, not because he cannot physically leave. He has traveled extensively over the centuries, but because Egypt is the context that makes his existence comprehensible, the landscape that holds his memories, the geography that connects his past to his present. He travels north to Alexandria, the city he knew in its Ptolemaic glory, now a sprawling modern metropolis of 5 million people, and he stands on the Corniche looking out at the Mediterranean, thinking about all the ships he has seen on these waters. Phoenician traders, Roman triremes, Venetian galleys, British steamships, modern container vessels. The library is gone, of course, burned long ago, its scrolls scattered or destroyed, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world lost. But he remembers it. He remembers the reading rooms with their shelves stretching toward high ceilings, the smell of papyrus and ink, The sound of scholars arguing in Greek and Aramaic and Egyptian, the sense that all human knowledge was being gathered in one place, preserved for future generations. That dream failed, as most dreams eventually fail, but the memory of it persists in him, a ghost haunting a mind that has accumulated too many ghosts to count. He sometimes thinks his mind is like the library, vast, holding more than it was designed to contain, slowly degrading as the sheer volume of information exceeds its capacity for organized retention. He forgets things now, not important things, but details, the names of people he knew in the 15th century, the exact location of a house he lived in during the Mamluk period, the face of a woman he loved in Constantinople during the Ottoman era. The losses are small but accumulating, and he wonders if eventually his memory will fail completely, if immortality will trap him in an eternal present without past, a wandering amnesia that persists physically while losing everything that makes persistence meaningful. And so he continues, because what else can he do? Death does not come for him, has not come in 3,300 years, shows no sign of approaching. He has tested it, carefully, in moments of despair, minor injuries that should kill, diseases that should be fatal, and always, impossibly, he survives, he heals, he persists. Whatever mechanism broke inside him on that day in 1324 BC, when the infection should have claimed him but didn't, remains broken. Or perhaps it was never broken, perhaps it was activated, some latent potential in human biology that manifests once in millions of cases, a genetic lottery whose prize is endless continuation. The scientists of the future, if they ever discover him, if he ever allows discovery, might find the explanation encoded in his DNA, might replicate it, might extend his curse to all of humanity. And he genuinely does not know whether this would be a blessing or a catastrophe. Would universal immortality create a utopia of accumulated wisdom and expertise, or a dystopia of stagnation and resource depletion? He suspects the latter. The world is already struggling to support 8 billion mortals, and mortality itself serves a function, clearing space for new generations, new ideas, new perspectives. Immortality at scale would freeze humanity in place, aging populations unable to die, consuming resources indefinitely, preventing the renewal that comes with birth and death and the natural cycle of generational change. But these are abstract problems, philosophical concerns that may never manifest. For now, he is alone in his persistence, and the world turns around him, indifferent to his existence. He develops routines to manage the weight of time. He creates projects, personal quests that give structure to the endless years. He decides to visit every major archaeological site related to ancient Egypt, from the pyramids at Giza to the temples at Abu Simbel, from the fortresses in Nubia to the workers' village at Deir el-Medina. He walks these sites, often alone, in the hours before dawn when tourists have not yet arrived, and he speaks to the stones in the old language, telling them they are remembered, that someone still knows their true purpose, their original names, the hands that shaped them. He stands at Abu Simbel as the sun rises, watching the light penetrate the temple sanctuary just as it was designed to do, illuminating the statues of Ramesses II and the gods on 2 days of the year. And he remembers the dedication ceremony, remembers standing in the crowd of officials and priests when this temple was new, when Ramesses was alive and ruling with the same absolute authority that Tutankhamun once possessed. Ramesses lived to 90, an extraordinary age for the time, and reigned for 66 years, and even he, blessed with longevity by ancient standards, died eventually, was mummified, was buried with the full honors of a god-king. His mummy survives, unwrapped by archaeologists, displayed in a museum, the body that once housed imperial power reduced to a curiosity for tourists. Tutankhamun wonders what Rameses would think of this. Would he be horrified? Or would he understand that this too is a form of immortality, being visible and known millennia after death, even if the context has become grotesque? The sun completes its alignment, the light fades from the sanctuary, and Tutankhamun walks back out into the growing heat of day, his shadow long and dark against the sand. The tourists begin to arrive, buses pulling up to the visitor center, guides beginning their rehearsed explanations of the temple's history and significance. He slips away unnoticed, just another solitary traveler, remarkable only in his unremarkableness. He has perfected the art of invisibility over his vast lifespan, not magical invisibility, but the social invisibility of the unexceptional, the person who blends into crowds, who draws no particular attention, who could be anyone and therefore is no one. It is a survival skill, developed over centuries of avoiding notice, and it serves him well in a world that has no category for what he is, no framework for understanding someone who has lived through the entire span of recorded history and beyond into the shadowy periods before writing made memory permanent. He returns to Thebes, to Luxor, walking through the temple complex at night when it is closed to visitors. He bribes a guard, not difficult, and he spends hours in the hypostyle hall, walking among the massive columns that he dedicated in his youth, running his hands over the hieroglyphs that describe his restoration of the temples after his father's heresy. The inscriptions praise him in the formulaic language of royal propaganda: the good God, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the son of Ra, the beloved of Amun. He remembers when these words meant something, when they carried weight and authority, when being pharaoh was not just a title but a responsibility, a relationship with the divine and the people and the land itself. Now they are just carvings, historical documents, interesting to scholars but divorced from any living power or meaning. He sits with his back against a column, looking up at the stars through the gaps in the roof, and he allows himself a moment of grief, not for what he has lost, though that is part of it, but for what he has become. He is a ghost haunting his own past, a remnant that should have dissolved into history but persists instead, outliving context, outliving purpose, outliving everything except the simple biological fact of continuation. The night is quiet except for distant sounds from the town, music from a cafe, the call to prayer from a mosque, the engine of a car passing on the road. Modern sounds in an ancient place, layers of time existing simultaneously, and he is the link between them, the living connection that spans from bronze to silicon, from hieroglyphs to digital text, from pharaonic theocracy to whatever the modern world is becoming. He does not know what the future holds. How could he? He has lived through every possible transformation of human society and still cannot predict what comes next. Each generation thinks it stands at the culmination of history, that the changes of its time are unprecedented, definitive, final, and each generation is proven wrong by the next, which transforms everything again, which makes yesterday's certainties obsolete and establishes new truths that will themselves become obsolete in time. 2026 approaches, and Egypt plans massive celebrations for the anniversary of various archaeological discoveries, the continuing fascination with its ancient past serving as a foundation for modern identity and tourism revenue. Tutankhamun watches the preparations with mixed feelings. His Egypt, the Egypt he ruled, is marketed now as a brand, a series of images and symbols divorced from the complex reality of the civilization that produced them. The pyramids on t-shirts, the Eye of Horus as jewelry, the pharaohs as exotic others rather than humans who struggled and loved and made mistakes and tried to govern justly in a complicated world. But perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps all pasts become simplified when viewed from sufficient distance, reduced to their most visually striking elements, their most easily understood narratives. He tries not to judge the present for failing to fully comprehend something that only he remembers completely. The young, he notices, are increasingly disconnected from history altogether. For them, ancient Egypt is as remote and fantastical as Middle-earth or Westeros, a fictional setting rather than the ancestral foundation of their own culture. This bothers him more than it should. He knows that each generation must find its own relationship to the past, that nostalgia is not wisdom, that change is inevitable. But still, he feels the loss, the slow erasure of everything he witnessed, everyone he knew, the world that shaped him vanishing even from cultural memory, leaving behind only fragments and myths and the perpetual face of the boy king who died at 19. Except he didn't. He walks through Cairo at night, the city that did not exist in his youth, built on layers of history that include Roman fortresses and Islamic mosques and British colonial architecture and modern concrete towers, and he thinks about palimpsests, about how the same ground holds multiple stories written over each other, most of them illegible, all of them claiming truth. Cairo is built on layers of vanished cities, on settlements that rose and fell over millennia, each one leaving traces, fragments, foundations that support what comes after. And he, Tutankhamun, is himself a kind of palimpsest, the boy king overlaid with the cautious advisor of the Ptolemaic era, overlaid with the merchant of the medieval period, overlaid with the anonymous wanderer of the modern age, each identity obscuring the ones before while still carrying them forward, still containing them within the accumulated self. He considers, sometimes, the possibility that he will outlive Egypt itself, that the nation-state which carries the name of his ancient kingdom will eventually dissolve or transform into something unrecognizable, that the language will die completely, that the last person who can read hieroglyphs will pass away, that the monuments will erode despite conservation efforts, that climate change or war or simple time will erase even the physical remnants, and he will still be here, the last living connection to a world that has completely disappeared. The thought fills him with a despair so profound that he has to sit down, breathing slowly, reminding himself that he has survived the destruction of everything before and can do so again. But there is a difference between surviving and living. He has survived for 3,000 years. But has he lived? What does it mean to live when you are unmoored from normal human context, when you form no lasting relationships, build no family, contribute no unique work that could not be accomplished by any other intelligent person with enough time and resources? His immortality has not made him superhuman. It has simply made him persistent. He is not wiser than any thoughtful elderly person. He simply has more data points from which to draw conclusions, more examples of patterns repeating, more evidence that human nature remains fundamentally unchanged despite technological progress. Love, fear, ambition, compassion, cruelty, the same emotions, the same drives, manifesting in different contexts but essentially unaltered from the people he knew in the courts of the 18th dynasty. This could be comforting, the idea that humanity retains some core identity across millennia, or it could be depressing, suggesting that growth and development are illusions, that we are trapped in cycles we cannot transcend. He chooses to find it comforting, mostly. The alternative is unbearable. The thought that his 3,000 years of observation have revealed nothing but futility, that all human effort amounts to nothing more than rearranging deck chairs on a ship that has no destination. Better to believe that the struggles matter, that the small acts of kindness and courage and creativity that he has witnessed across the centuries have meaning even if they do not permanently transform human nature, even if each generation must learn the same lessons and fight the same battles and make the same mistakes. He meets other immortals sometimes, or at least, he suspects he does. Once, in a cafe in Vienna in 1873, he locked eyes with a woman who looked at him with a recognition that went beyond normal human acknowledgement, as if she saw past his current appearance to something deeper, something eternal. They did not speak. He was too afraid, too uncertain, and she left before he could gather courage to approach her. He has wondered about her ever since. Was she like him? Or was he projecting his own uniqueness onto a stranger, desperate to find companionship in his singular condition? He will never know. The possibility of other immortals remains theoretical, a hope he cannot quite abandon but cannot confirm. If they exist, they are as hidden as he is, as careful, as unwilling to reveal themselves, and perhaps that itself is evidence. Anyone who had lived for centuries would learn caution, would understand the danger of exposure, would cultivate anonymity as a survival skill. But even if others exist, would it matter? Would they truly understand each other? Or would their different contexts, their different origins, their different millennia of accumulated experience make them as alien to each other as they are to normal humans? He suspects the latter. Immortality might be a shared condition, but each immortal would experience it uniquely, shaped by when they were born, where they lived, what historical currents swept through their centuries. His immortality is inseparable from Egypt, from the Nile, from the religion and culture of the New Kingdom. Another immortal from ancient China or medieval Europe would have an entirely different relationship to time and continuity. So even in the impossible scenario of finding peers, he would still be fundamentally alone, still the only person who carries this particular memory, this specific accumulation of Egyptian history lived rather than studied. He has accepted this, mostly. The loneliness is not acute anymore, not the sharp pain it was in those early centuries when he still hoped that somehow, impossibly, he might find someone who understood. Now it is a dull ache, a background condition of existence, no more remarkable than the persistence of his own heartbeat, both inevitable and largely ignored except in moments of particular stress or contemplation. He thinks about writing his story, the true account of 3,000 years observed from inside the flow of time. But to what purpose? Who would believe it? And even if he could prove it somehow, document it convincingly, what would it accomplish except to make himself a spectacle, a scientific curiosity, possibly a prisoner of governments or institutions that would want to study him, exploit him, understand the mechanism of his immortality for their own purposes? Better to remain silent, to keep his secret, to continue moving through the world as he has moved for centuries, unnoticed, unremarked, carrying his impossible history as private knowledge. He does create documents, though fragmentary accounts, pieces of memory preserved in writing and hidden in locations known only to him. He buries them in waterproof containers in the desert, seals them in jars and hides them in caves, deposits them in safety deposit boxes under false names with instructions for delivery decades in the future to addresses that may or may not still exist. These are his messages to posterity, or perhaps to himself. If he continues living, he can recover them, read his own accounts of periods that are fading from memory, use them to reconstruct the details that even his extraordinary recall cannot indefinitely preserve. And if he finally dies, if the impossible persistence finally ends, then perhaps someone will find these documents, will piece together the story, will realize that one man lived through it all and left fragments scattered across the landscape like archaeological evidence of his own impossible biography. The Grand Egyptian Museum opens fully, its construction delayed for years by political and financial complications, and Tutankhamun visits on opening day, walking through galleries that display the complete treasures from the tomb that should have been his, the golden mask, the chariots, the beds and chairs and jewelry, and all the elaborate provisions for an afterlife that he never needed because he never died. Tourists crowd around the displays, taking photographs, marveling at the craftsmanship, and he stands among them, unremarkable in his modern clothes, and he listens to tour guides explaining the significance of each object, getting some details right and many details wrong, and he says nothing. He has learned, over his vast lifespan, when to speak and when to remain silent, and this is definitively a time for silence. The museum contains a reconstruction of the burial chamber as it would have appeared when sealed, the walls covered in the distinctive art of the period, the sarcophagus in place, everything arranged according to the specifications of funerary ritual. He looks at the reconstruction and feels a strange doubling of perception. This is how his death should have looked, the conclusion that history intended for him, the ending that would have been normal, appropriate, consistent with every other pharaoh who ever lived. Instead, he is standing in a museum 3,000 years later, looking at a simulation of an event that never occurred, his own funeral staged for educational purposes while the actual person it was meant to commemorate continues existing in violation of every natural law and cultural expectation. The irony is so profound it almost makes him laugh, almost, but not quite, because the weight of it is crushing, the sense that his entire impossible existence is an aberration, a mistake, a glitch in the cosmic program that should have terminated long ago but somehow persists, accumulating consequence and complication with each passing year. He leaves the museum as the sun sets, walking back into Cairo, into the evening traffic and the evening prayers and the evening routines of millions of ordinary people living ordinary finite lives, and he envies them, briefly, intensely, envies their mortality, their natural endings, the fact that their stories will conclude in the normal way, that they will not be forced to witness the slow erosion of everything they know and love, that they will not outlive context and meaning and purpose. But the envy passes, as all emotions pass for him eventually, worn smooth by the repetition of centuries until even the most intense feelings become familiar, manageable, no longer capable of overwhelming the accumulated stability of his extended consciousness. He has felt everything countless times, joy and sorrow, love and loss, fear and courage, despair and hope, and the repetition has not eliminated the emotions but has changed his relationship to them, made them recognizable as temporary states rather than permanent conditions, weather patterns moving through the landscape of self rather than fundamental truths about existence. 2027. And the world continues its acceleration toward futures he cannot imagine despite having imagined every previous transformation. Artificial intelligence develops capabilities that seem magical even to him, someone who has watched the entire progression from counting on fingers to quantum computing, machine learning, neural networks, systems that can generate text and images and solutions to complex problems with a facility that rivals or exceeds human capability in specific domains. He wonders what these systems would make of his story, whether an AI trained on all recorded history could believe in or understand the existence of one man who lived through all of it, or whether the claim would be rejected as statistically impossible, as noise in the data, as fiction masquerading as fact. He experiments, carefully, creating anonymous accounts on forums dedicated to artificial intelligence, posing hypothetical questions about biological immortality, about the psychological effects of extreme longevity, about the philosophical implications of existing across historical periods that are normally studied as distinct epochs. The responses are thoughtful but ultimately academic, treating his questions as intellectual exercises rather than urgent personal inquiries, and he realizes that there is no language adequate to the reality of his condition, no framework within normal human discourse that can contain what he has experienced. Even if he revealed himself, even if he proved beyond doubt that he is who he claims to be, the understanding would remain incomplete. People could accept the fact of his immortality while still failing to grasp the lived experience of it, the phenomenology of consciousness extended across millennia, the way time feels different when you have enough of it to watch empires rise and fall like seasons. Egypt announces plans for another major archaeological initiative, using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar to search for undiscovered tombs in the Valley of the Kings and surrounding areas. Tutankhamun reads the announcement with interest. There are tombs yet to be found, he knows, because he remembers their construction, their ceiling, their approximate locations. He could guide the archaeologists, could save them years of searching, but of course he cannot. Revealing such knowledge would require explaining how he possesses it, and that explanation would unravel everything, would transform his carefully maintained anonymity into spectacle and scrutiny. He decides, standing by the Nile at dawn as he has done countless times before, that he will dedicate the next century to preservation, not of his own life, which seems to preserve itself without effort, but of memory, of knowledge, of the fragments of ancient Egypt that still remain. He begins writing, using modern technology, creating digital documents that encode the old language as he actually spoke it, the pronunciation, the idioms, the jokes and metaphors that made ancient Egyptian a living tongue rather than a dead text. He writes descriptions of daily life in the 18th dynasty, not the grand historical events that survive in temple inscriptions, but the small details, how bread was made, how children played, what music sounded like, how the palace smelled on summer evenings when the lotus bloomed in the pools and the servants lit incense to drive away mosquitoes. He writes about the texture of linen in his youth, coarser than modern fabrics but comfortable in the heat, about the taste of the beer brewed in the palace kitchens, thick and nutritious and slightly sour, about the sound of the Nile lapping against the mooring stones where the royal barge was tied, a constant gentle rhythm that underlay all palace life. These are the details that do not survive in archaeological record, the ephemera that vanish with the last person who experienced them. And he is that last person, the only remaining witness to an entire sensory world that existed and functioned and then ceased, leaving no trace except in his improbable memory. He creates anonymous online repositories, uploading his writings to obscure academic servers, framing them as speculative reconstructions rather than eyewitness accounts, and he watches as occasional scholars stumble across them, debate their validity, sometimes incorporate his details into broader reconstructions of ancient Egyptian culture. This is his legacy, perhaps, not rulership, not the restoration of temples or the defeat of enemies, but this quiet preservation of truth, these fragments of memory distributed across the digital networks of the 21st century, surviving in a new medium, invisible yet present, available to anyone who cares to look but claimed by no one, attributed to no source, simply existing as data in the vast ocean of information that defines the modern world. He thinks about the nature of immortality, not his own biological persistence, but the various forms of symbolic immortality that humans create to transcend death. The pyramids were built as immortality machines, monuments designed to preserve the names and ka of the pharaohs who commissioned them, and they have succeeded, in a sense, because people still speak the names of Khufu and Khafra and Menkaure thousands of years after their deaths. But the immortality is hollow, the names survive. But who were these men really? What did they love? What made them laugh? What kept them awake at night? The monuments preserve identity in the most abstract sense while losing everything particular, everything human, everything that would make these ancient rulers recognizable as people rather than symbols. His own immortality is the opposite. His identity is lost, forgotten, replaced by a false narrative of early death and spectacular burial, while his actual self persists in specificity, in detail, in the retention of personality and memory and all the qualities that make a person who they are. But this preservation is private, invisible, meaningless to anyone except himself. Where the pyramids offer public immortality without substance, his condition offers substantial persistence without recognition. Perhaps true immortality, he thinks, would combine both aspects, the preservation of specific individual consciousness and memory combined with public acknowledgement and continued relevance to living communities. But such immortality is impossible, has always been impossible, will always be impossible no matter what technologies emerge or what religious promises are made. The dead are dead, their consciousness dissolved, and any memory of them is reconstruction, interpretation, necessarily incomplete and distorted by the needs and biases of those who do the remembering. Even his own memories of people long dead are suspect. He cannot remember Ankhesenamun exactly as she was, only as he recalls her, filtered through 3,000 years of subsequent experience and the subtle alterations that occur every time a memory is accessed and reconsolidated. And so he continues, because what else can he do? Death does not come for him, has not come in 3,300 years, shows no sign of approaching. He has tested it, carefully, in moments of despair, minor injuries that should kill, diseases that should be fatal, and always, impossibly, he survives, he heals, he persists. Whatever mechanism broke inside him on that day in 1324 BC, when the infection should have claimed him but didn't, remains broken. Or perhaps it was never broken. Perhaps it was activated. Some latent potential in human biology that manifests once in millions of cases. A genetic lottery whose prize is endless continuation. The scientists of the future, if they ever discover him, if he ever allows discovery, might find the explanation encoded in his DNA, might replicate it, might extend his curse to all of humanity. And he genuinely does not know whether this would be a blessing or a catastrophe. Would universal immortality create a utopia of accumulated wisdom and expertise, or a dystopia of stagnation and resource depletion? He suspects the latter. The world is already struggling to support 8 billion mortals, and mortality itself serves a function, clearing space for new generations, new ideas, new perspectives. Immortality at scale would freeze humanity in place, aging populations unable to die, consuming resources indefinitely, preventing the renewal that comes with birth and death and the natural cycle of generational change. But these are abstract problems, philosophical concerns that may never manifest. For now, he is alone in his persistence, and the world turns around him, indifferent to his existence, and Egypt. Egypt endures in a new form, modern and struggling and disconnected from its ancient glory, but still Egypt, still the civilization that gave birth to him, still the land watered by the Nile, still the place where the sun rises over the eastern desert and sets beyond the western cliffs and the pyramids stand against the horizon like eternal markers of time, and Tutankhamun, who should have been buried beneath those western cliffs 3,000 years ago, watches the sunset from a Cairo rooftop, feeling the warm evening breeze that has touched this land for millions of years before him and will continue for millions of years after, even if he, impossible as it seems, survives to witness them all, continuing forward into centuries that cannot yet imagine him, into futures where Egypt may be drowned by rising seas or transformed beyond recognition or somehow, impossibly, endure as it has endured through every previous transformation, adapting, changing, persisting in new forms, while carrying forward some essence of what it has always been, and he will be there to witness it, the eternal Pharaoh, the boy king who never died, moving through time like a river through desert, shaping and being shaped, remembering and forgetting. Alone but not entirely alone because the land itself remembers, the stones remember, the Nile remembers, and together they constitute a continuity that transcends individual consciousness, a persistence beyond persistence, an immortality that encompasses both the man who will not die and the civilization that gives his endless life its only meaning.